My name is Sierra Walker. I'm 29. And the night my brother Damien stood in a ballroom full of investors, raised his glass, and called me a useless dropout, I smiled. But inside I burned. His voice, confident, oiled with charm, echoed off marble walls and crystal chandeliers like it belonged there. Like I didn't. People laughed. Comfortable laughter. The kind that comes when humiliation sounds like a joke. And the target knows better than to react. I sat 2 rows down, close enough to hear Dad say under his breath, "She's here." Like I was a problem to tolerate, not a daughter to welcome. My napkin trembled in my lap, even as I kept my smile picture perfect. The lights turned golden for the press photos, making Damien's cufflinks sparkle, making the Hayes Consulting logo shimmer behind him like a throne room backdrop. And then he raised his glass even higher and said, "To Sierra, my compass for every wrong turn I've avoided." More laughter, more cameras, more applause for him, more silence for me. But what nobody knew, not Damien, not Dad, not any of the investors raising their champagne flutes, was this. I already owned 38% of the firm that just signed Hayes Consulting's biggest competitor. They didn't see me coming, because they never bothered to look. Stick around. Because what happened the next morning by 9 a.m. sharp cost Damien 2 investors, a front-page headline, and the one thing he never thought he'd lose: control. Also, before we dive into this, let me know in the comments, have you ever been underestimated, only to prove them all wrong when it mattered most? The toast echoed in the high-ceiling ballroom, bouncing off marble and crystal like a slap in the face I had to pretend didn't sting. Damien's voice, smooth, confident, oiled with self-assurance, carried effortlessly across the room. Laughter followed, not forced, not malicious, just comfortable. Comfortable in the assumption that what he said was harmless, playful, deserved. The last time Dad looked at me like I was invisible, I was 18, packing my dorm room in silence. I could still feel the stiffness of his shoulder brushing past me as he walked out without a word, leaving behind a vacuum that never quite closed. That same cold glance, sharp and empty, now pierced across the champagne flutes from the head table. I sat 2 rows down, close enough to hear him say, "She's here," with a tone that barely masked his disapproval, but not close enough to matter. I adjusted the napkin on my lap to keep my fingers from curling into fists. The lights were soft and golden, meant to flatter Damien's skin tone for the press photos. He looked like he belonged here. Polished suit, inherited charm, every button and word perfectly in place. Behind him, the Hayes Consulting logo shimmered on a giant LED screen. This was his night, his throne, and I was… what? The court jester? Sierra, he called out halfway through the speech, taught me more than any school ever could. For a moment I looked up. He gestured grandly, the spotlight catching the crystal in his cufflink. She taught me what failure looks like, how not to quit halfway through a dream, and most importantly, what not to do when someone offers you a hand up. Laughter again, louder this time. Even Charles chuckled. I lifted my champagne, eyes locked with Damien's. Smiled. A full, toothy, well-practiced smile that made the investor from Westgate blink in surprise. He was seated nearby, flanked by 2 executives in matching gray suits, his mouth twitching with something that wasn't quite amusement. Maybe pity, maybe curiosity. Either way, he looked at me longer than anyone else did. "And so," Damien continued, raising his glass higher, "to Sierra, my brilliant sister, my compass for every wrong turn I've avoided." I clinked glasses with the air, still smiling. But my other hand, the one under the white linen tablecloth, was curled so tight around my clutch I could feel the metal clasp digging into my palm. They don't know. They think this is just another party I came to out of guilt or boredom or masochism. They don't know I own a quiet 38% of the firm that just signed Hayes Consulting's biggest competitor. They don't know what I've built in the shadows they pushed me into. I dropped my gaze briefly to the photo peeking out from my wallet, tucked just under my phone. My mother, Meredith, mid-laugh, wind in her hair. She would have hated this. The suits, the performance, the falseness of it all. She would have walked out with her head high and taken me with her. But Meredith Walker was gone, and I was still here. "Sierra," Dad said, after the applause died. "We're glad you could make it." He didn't stand, didn't even shift his weight. "I wouldn't miss it," I replied, my voice even. I didn't need the mic to make it carry. Watching excellence up close? Always a privilege. A few chuckles fluttered. Damien smirked, satisfied. He thought he'd won. My phone buzzed in my lap. A message from Chloe. "Ready for tomorrow? Launch set for 9 a.m. sharp. Your calendar's blocked." I tapped back. Let it burn. Nobody noticed me slip out 5 minutes later. They were still drinking to Damien's glory, to Charles's legacy, to Hayes's future. But I was already halfway to the exit, the ballroom's laughter fading behind me like a dull hum. The next day, I think to myself, will be one they'll never forget. By 9 a.m., 2 investors had already pulled out. By noon, the press was circling like vultures. The day started with silence. Not peace. Silence. That kind of uneasy pin-drop hush that creeps in before a building implodes. I sat at my desk in the corner office of Novatech, watching the Chicago skyline fade behind thickening clouds. The phone buzzed nonstop. Slack pinged every few seconds. My inbox was a graveyard of flagged emails, most marked urgent, all in red. The night before had been brutal. The day after was war. The next day changed everything. I had promised myself. And it did. Just not the way I imagined. Subject: capital reallocation effective immediately from Westgate Capital. Time: 8:47 a.m. In light of reputational concerns and strategic reassessment, we will be withdrawing our commitment to Series C funding effective today. We thank you for your time and wish you continued success. No phone call, no explanation, just a bullet between the ribs dressed as a polite email. I didn't flinch, not visibly. But my throat tightened so hard I had to sip cold coffee just to swallow. Across the hall, people whispered. Some stared at me like I was a ticking bomb. Others avoided eye contact entirely. An intern bumped into a chair and mumbled an apology no one heard. On Slack, someone posted the link. Startup founded by Stanford dropout crumbles. After scandalous family fallout, Chicago Business Times. They used a photo of me from last year's Forbes panel, caught mid-blink, awkward, unflattering. The quote under it read, "Sometimes walking away is winning." Not helpful. I skimmed the article. It read like Damien wrote it himself. An anonymous source close to the family suggested poor leadership. An insider mentioned Novatech's disarray. Even Charles was quoted vaguely. Some people just aren't built for the pressure. At 11:15, I called an emergency meeting. The communications lead, Theo, came in with bloodshot eyes and a folder full of crisis strategies. 2 managers sat stiffly, glancing at each other more than at me. I saw it in their eyes. Doubt. Fear. Maybe even betrayal. "Before we start," I said, calm and clear, "I know what you're thinking." Theo shifted in his seat. Someone coughed. "You think this is the end?" I continued, "and that Hayes will absorb what's left." Silence. "If that's what you believe," I said, "you're free to leave. No questions asked. No hard feelings." One of the senior dev leads stood halfway, paused, then sat down again. I pulled out a simple white card from my blazer pocket and placed it on the table. "Give me 48 hours. Nobody replied. Nobody moved. I nodded once and walked out. My office felt smaller than usual. The air was thick with tension and the smell of old takeout. I stared at the framed quote from Mom on the wall. Her actual handwriting in gold foil. Silence is the most powerful weapon if you know when to break it. And right now, I wasn't breaking anything. I was holding the pressure, letting it build. At 2:17 p.m., Chloe texted. Chloe, I need to talk. I know what Damien did. I stared at the screen. What Damien did. She knew. That wasn't a guess. It was a statement. And Chloe didn't deal in rumors. She had been inside Hayes before jumping ship to Novatech. She'd seen things. I didn't reply. Not yet. I stood and walked slowly to the balcony, the glass door moaning open with a tired creak. Outside, the wind sliced against my cheeks like truth. Cold, clear, purifying. Downtown stretched below me, gray, humming, relentless. I leaned on the railing, watching the cars snake down Wacker Drive, tiny and fast. I breathed in the wind, the noise, the panic I refused to show. The game, I whispered, has just begun. It wasn't a bombshell. It was a whisper, but it cracked the whole house. The cafe was nearly empty when I walked in. A rainy Wednesday in May had a way of softening the edges of downtown Chicago. Outside, Navy Pier was all mist and muffled footsteps. Inside, the hum of an old espresso machine and the faint sound of jazz made the place feel like a held breath. Chloe was already there, hood up, fingers wrapped tightly around a ceramic mug she hadn't touched. Her eyes darted toward the window when the door opened, but when she saw me, she relaxed, just barely. I slid into the booth across from her. No hugs, no small talk. For a second, neither of us said anything. You came alone? She asked, voice low. I didn't bring a sniper, I said, deadpan. You? A corner of her mouth twitched. Not a smile, but something close. Her eyes, though, those were glassy, tired, maybe ashamed. She pulled out a flash drive and placed it on the table like it might bite her. That's everything, she said. Contracts, internal memos, emails, invoices that were scrubbed, but not well enough. Damien had us inflate metrics ahead of each investor pitch. Westgate, Latham, Ryler's. He fed them fake growth models. I picked up the drive without touching her hand, slid it into my jacket. Why now? She looked down. Because I didn't know it would go this far. Because I didn't think he'd come for you too. And because I owe you. Her voice broke a little on that last line, but she didn't cry. Chloe Hayes didn't cry. Not in public. I nodded. What did he promise you to stay quiet? She laughed softly. A VP title, stock options, a seat at the table. And he gave them to someone else, a guy he met at a cigar lounge in Miami. Of course he did. I waved my phone over the table, opening my anti-fraud app, inserted the drive, loaded the files, contract, authentic, email headers, traceable, invoices, modified but reversibly. Everything was real. Ugly, but real. I looked up and saw Elaine Sutton through the window, sitting alone outside under a green umbrella. No laptop, just her signature navy trench and a small leather notebook. She looked up and nodded once when our eyes met. She always knew the moment to appear and the moment to disappear. She doesn't come in? Chloe asked. She's not here for coffee, I said. She's here for confirmation. Elaine took a sip of her tea, opened her notebook, and began writing. That was her signal. Message received. Wheels turning. I turned back to Chloe. This is good, but you know what happens next, right? You go to the press? Not yet, that's reactive. She frowned. Then what? We go on offense. I took out my tablet and laid it on the table, opened a blueprint, lines of code, design sketches, and UI flowcharts. Nova Pulse, our next-gen platform. Something Hayes had no idea existed. Something real. Something better. Chloe's eyes widened. You're launching? Not yet. First, we leak a demo. Something that looks accidental. Then we let the market speculate. Let Damien panic. Let him bury himself in the lie. And then I speak. Chloe stared at the screen. You're playing a long game. No, I said. I'm playing the game he doesn't know exists. She leaned back in her chair, exhaling like she'd just realized she was part of something bigger than she could control. Maybe she was. I wasn't here to reassure her. You didn't just hand me proof, I said. You handed me the first domino. She nodded slowly, but I caught the flicker of regret in her eyes. Or maybe fear. Either way, I'd keep her close, but never too close. As she stood to leave, I remained at the table, fingers sliding across the tablet screen. I opened the Novapulse design file and smiled. Let's see if they're ready for this. They thought I'd crawl back. Instead, I built a stage. The lights dimmed, and for a breathless moment, the only sound in the hall was the soft hum of the projectors. Then the screen behind me ignited in electric blue, casting the Novapulse logo across the wide marble walls of the peninsula's grand ballroom. Rows of chairs were filled. Investors, journalists, tech insiders, and curious onlookers, all dressed in polished evening wear, clutching glasses of champagne or tablet styluses like weapons of survival. I stepped forward. No podium, no teleprompter, just me in a charcoal jumpsuit and heels that made exactly the kind of statement I wanted. Stable, silent, lethal. They expected a nervous apology, a pivot speech, maybe a watered-down announcement about restructuring. Instead, I gave them a future they didn't know they'd been begging for. I won't waste your time, I said, voice steady, because time is the only thing this industry cannot afford to lose. What we're showing you tonight isn't just software. It's the start of something that watches the markets in real time, learns in seconds, and evolves before your competitors know what happened. Novapulse emerged on the screen like a living organism, its interface adapting in real time, responding to live stock feeds, social sentiment data, and predictive modeling with eerie elegance. I didn't need dramatic flair. The tech spoke for itself, and it whispered revolutions. In the second row, I caught sight of Westgate's lead partner, head slightly tilted, eyes narrowed in awe. Behind him, a CNBC reporter was already scribbling notes. And in the very back, just as expected, Damien slipped in, late, underdressed, but with the entitlement of someone convinced the spotlight still belonged to him. He was not on the guest list, but Chloe made sure the live stream link had been sent directly to his phone. At that exact moment, she stepped on stage beside me, radiant in navy silk, holding a slim mic. Her job wasn't to pitch, it was to provoke. We've opened a new round of Series D, she said smoothly. Version 2.0 is already in beta. We're considering select partners, those committed to transparency and long-term vision. The phrase hung in the air like bait. Chloe glanced at the camera. And yes, even Hayes Group is welcome to participate, if they're ready to align with our values. Behind the camera lens, I could see Damien freeze. His instinct kicked in. He pushed his way forward, chin high, grin tight. Of course, he said, loud enough for the mic to pick up. We're on board. We'll clean up the numbers like we did last year, don't worry. The words came out smooth, practiced, arrogant. And he had no idea the backstage cam, live on a secondary feed, split-screened for full transparency, had just caught him in 4K. Gasps rippled. Chloe's eyes flickered to mine, and I gave the smallest nod. We didn't pause the presentation. We didn't react. The silence was more damning than any outburst. The rest of the night unfolded in a blur of polite applause, sharp camera flashes, and the rising buzz of Twitter alerts. By 9 p.m., the hashtag the Dropout Queen was trending. I walked off stage, heartbeat steady, heels clicking softly on polished wood. Backstage, a monitor replayed Damien's moment of self-sabotage on loop. Some intern tried to mute it. Elaine walked in before they could. She stood behind me, arms folded, eyes calm. Ready for step 2? She asked. I didn't answer. I didn't have to. No one smells blood like investors, and this morning they all circled Damien. Monday came with sharp suits and sharper tongues. The walls of Hayes Consulting's boardroom were soundproofed, but not immune to pressure. A long obsidian table stretched down the center of the room like a surgical slab. Every chair was filled. The air was laced with tension and something darker: fear. At precisely 8 a.m., the emergency board meeting began. Live streamed internally, confidentially. Though we both knew nothing stayed internal for long. Damien sat at the head of the table, still clinging to his tailored confidence, but his jaw was tighter than usual. His tie was perfect. His watch gleamed, but his eyes flicked toward every movement like a man watching shadows close in. "We'll open with the matter at hand," said a director from the far end, adjusting his glasses. "Friday's remarks, recorded and distributed publicly, have triggered a preliminary compliance review. We've been contacted by 3 investor groups and a federal inquiry." Damien leaned forward. "That clip was taken out of context. I never said I cleaned up numbers like last year," another board member quoted, flipping open a printout. "Your words, Damien. Live. Public." "I was speaking casually," he insisted. "We all know metrics are fluid during development." "We're not talking about semantics," someone else cut in. "We're talking about fraud." The door opened quietly and Chloe stepped in. She didn't sit. She walked straight to the end of the table and placed a folder in front of the general counsel. Inside, a contract, signed by Damien, dated, attached to a financial statement now proven false. He didn't look at it. "I never saw that version," Damien said. But no one was listening. And then the screen at the front of the room lit up with a soft chime. A Zoom window opened. I didn't wait for an invitation. "Good morning," I said, seated calmly in my own office, sunlight glowing behind me. "I'll keep this short." Charles was there, silent, older today than he had been Friday. He didn't greet me. He didn't look away either. I tapped a key and another window appeared. A series of emails, each time-stamped, each showing Damien approving investor decks with manipulated charts. My lawyer sat beside me off camera, reading them line by line. "Mr. Hayes," one of the directors said, voice sharp, "is this your signature?" Damien didn't answer. The room was still. Across my screen, a ticker from Bloomberg scrolled live. Hayes Consulting stock, minus 11.2%. I didn't smile. I didn't flinch. I simply spoke. "This isn't about revenge," I said, gaze steady. "It's about receipts." The board fell quiet. Someone coughed. Someone else cursed under their breath. Then the motion was made. Effective immediately, Damien Walker was suspended as interim CEO pending a full audit and review. A vote followed. Unanimous. He stood slowly, face unreadable. Charles remained seated. "You have nothing to say?" Damien asked him. Still silence. And that silence rang louder than any insult. Damien left the room. He didn't slam the door. He didn't argue. Just walked out. Shoulders stiff, tie slightly askew for the first time in his life without a buffer. Outside, he tapped the key fob in his pocket twice. Then again. Nothing. The matte black company Mercedes, usually waiting at the curb like a trained dog, was gone. Repossession order, processed overnight. He stood there for a beat too long, alone on the marble steps of the building his name had once lit up. Back inside the boardroom, the call disconnected. But elsewhere, in a quieter corner of the Peninsula Lounge, Elaine sipped green tea with a young founder in a navy hoodie. The startup was called Circuit Stream, Hayes' rising competitor. Novatech had just signed their first joint initiative, and Sierra Walker had moved on to her next game. They spent years telling me I had no voice, so I bought the microphone. The wind was gentler than I expected that night, carrying only faint wisps of city traffic up to the rooftop of Ciel Bleu, the restaurant where, years ago, my father toasted Damien's acceptance to Wharton with a magnum of Dom Perignon and a smirk that never reached me. The view hadn't changed. Chicago still glittered below like a shattered chandelier. But I had. Charles Walker was already seated when I arrived, still in his signature navy suit, still wearing the same watch I'd once saved up 3 months' salary to buy him for Father's Day, before he stopped calling it that. He rose halfway, then sat back down without shaking my hand. "I wasn't sure you'd come," he said. "I was," I replied, easing into the chair across from him. "I just wasn't sure how long I'd stay." He offered a tight nod, gesturing toward the waiter. I waved it off. I wasn't there to dine. There was an odd pause, like neither of us quite knew the script. Then, predictably, he filled the silence with control. "You've made quite a statement," he said, adjusting his cuffs. "Novapulse, the press, the SEC thing. I assume you feel vindicated?" "This isn't about feelings," I replied. "It never was." He shifted, just slightly. "I know Damien. Made mistakes," he said carefully. "We all do, but that doesn't mean everything we did as a family was wrong." I raised an eyebrow. "You didn't just choose a son," I said, voice level. "You erased a daughter." He flinched. Just barely, but enough. "Sierra," he began, like the syllables of my name tasted foreign. "You were always so independent. I didn't think you needed—" "I didn't need your approval," I interrupted. "But I did notice when you gave it to everyone else." Silence again. Except this time, I let it sit. Our entrees came and went untouched. I sipped water. He stirred wine. When the check arrived, he reached for it. I beat him to it. "No," I said simply. "Let me." He watched me slide the card across the table like it was a declaration of war. Maybe it was. Or maybe it was just peace, finally on my terms. As we stood, I pulled a small velvet pouch from my bag and set it on the table. Inside were the keys to the Bentley, the one he once forbade me to touch because failure doesn't get privileges. "I don't need this anymore," I said. Charles didn't open the pouch. He didn't ask me to take it back. He just looked at me like a man realizing the door was already closed and he'd been knocking on a wall. I walked away without another word. At the elevator, Elaine was waiting. She wore a soft smile and carried a single envelope, my keynote script, printed and watermarked. "You still want to do this?" she asked. "I already did," I said. And that night, at 11:57 p.m., I hit publish. From Dropout to Founder, what they never taught me in school went live on Novatech's blog and syndication feeds. By dawn, it had been reshared by Forbes, TechCrunch, and even Stanford's alumni network. The essay didn't attack. It didn't brag. It simply told the truth about being overlooked, underestimated, and choosing to build without permission. I didn't check the stats. I didn't need to. Back at Ciel Bleu, as the last guests filtered out and waitstaff dimmed the sconces, a television above the bar played on mute. The anchor's lips moved silently. "Breaking. Damien Walker subpoenaed to testify before the SEC." Charles looked up from his glass, watching the footage of his son flash across the screen, then quietly picked up the remote and turned it off. I didn't rise above them. I walked away. They didn't hear the first time I spoke, so I learned to let silence do the heavy lifting. When I walked out of that rooftop restaurant, the keys to the Bentley still sitting untouched on the linen tablecloth, I didn't feel triumphant. I felt finished. Not defeated. Not exhausted. Just finished, with explaining, with performing, with seeking approval from people who only ever saw me as a shadow. The city lights shimmered below, just like they had the night Damien got his first promotion. Back then, I was 17, watching from the valet window, too embarrassed to walk in. My father told the host I wasn't coming, even though he knew I was already outside, waiting. That night, I ate takeout on the steps of the parking garage while they toasted his future with oysters and aged scotch. And yet, somehow, I still wanted their love for years after. But something shifted this time. Not just in the public eye, not just in the stock tickers or headlines, but deep inside. I didn't rise above them. I simply stopped shrinking to fit beside them. Damien's name now trailed hashtags of disgrace, his resignation followed by subpoenas and lawyers clawing through the debris. But I didn't celebrate. I didn't post a victory video. I didn't gloat. Instead, I wrote. The blog post wasn't meant to go viral. It was meant to go home. To the ones who had ever been called the disappointment, the burden, the weak link. To every woman in every meeting who was smiled at, nodded at, and then ignored. To the sons who were never enough and the daughters who were too much. My inbox flooded overnight. Strangers, employees, former classmates. Even an old professor who once told me I lacked follow-through. They all wrote the same thing. Thank you. You said what I've always wanted to say. But the truth is, I didn't say it for them. I said it because if I hadn't, I would have become the version of myself they always hoped I'd be. Quiet, compliant, and invisible. And I'm done being invisible. Sometimes justice doesn't arrive on horseback or in headlines. Sometimes it walks in on quiet feet, holding a stack of receipts and a resignation letter. Sierra didn't burn down her family. She simply refused to be rebuilt by their version of her. In doing so, she showed that revenge isn't always loud, and dignity doesn't need an audience. When injustice is met with persistence, not rage, and when silence is broken not by screams but by clarity, the effect is irreversible. Because no wall of lies can stand forever against the tide of truth. And perhaps that is the final truth. That those who are underestimated the longest often rise the highest. Not because they wanted vengeance, but because they chose to rise anyway. Maybe this story was never really about Damien, or my father, or any of the people who decided my worth for me. Maybe it was always about this. What happens when the person you spent years underestimating finally stops asking for a seat at your table and builds her own? I didn't need to shout. I didn't need revenge speeches or dramatic exits. All I needed was proof, paperwork, receipts, and the willingness to let the truth speak louder than my anger. For anyone out there who's been made to feel small, whether it was in a boardroom, a family gathering, or across a dinner table with people who should have known better, let me say this. Your silence doesn't mean you're weak. It means you're waiting, choosing your moment, sharpening your tools. And when that moment comes, you won't need to scream to be heard. You'll speak once, with clarity, with evidence, and the walls that were built to keep you small will crack from the inside. Thank you for staying with me through this story. For every second you listened, for every person you thought of while hearing these words, thank you. Because stories like this don't get told unless people like you choose to hear them. If this hit home for you, if you've ever sat in a room full of people who laughed at your expense, who called you too sensitive or not good enough, do me one small favor. Drop a comment below. Tell me the moment you realized you deserved better. Or just type, I choose me. If that's all you have the energy for today, that's enough. And if you want more stories like this, about quiet wins, about reclaiming power, about people like us choosing ourselves without asking permission, hit like, subscribe, and share this with someone else who might be sitting at their own table tonight, trying to remember they're worth more than the silence they've been handed. Because if there's one thing this story taught me, it's that being underestimated was the best advantage I ever had. Thanks for listening, and I'll see you in the next story.